In a picturesque suburban neighborhood, where tree-lined streets and manicured lawns painted a scene of tranquility, lived the Thomas family. At first glance, their life appeared to be the epitome of success and happiness. Michael, the father, was a dynamic CEO known for his sharp intellect and unwavering dedication to his career. His wife, Julia, was a prominent lawyer, her days consumed by court cases and legal briefs. Together, they embodied the modern American dream, two professionals thriving in their respective fields, raising a family in a world that seemed to smile upon them. However, beneath this polished surface lay a troubling reality that few could see. Their pride and joy, a lively young girl named Amara, was trapped in a world of silent suffering, her vibrant laughter replaced by an uneasy stillness. As the camera panned through their home, capturing moments of family life, the bustling breakfast table, the evening rush of children's laughter, it quickly transitioned to Amara's solitary existence, shadowed by the looming presence of Elizabeth, the nanny they had hired to care for their beloved daughter. Elizabeth initially presented herself as the ideal caregiver, warm, attentive, and nurturing. With her engaging smile and seemingly boundless patience, she quickly became a staple in the Thomas household, effortlessly slipping into the rhythm of their lives. For Michael and Julia, hiring Elizabeth was a necessity. Their demanding careers left little room for the day-to-day responsibilities of parenthood. They had hoped that with her help, they could provide Amara with a loving environment filled with the opportunities they both cherished. Little did they know that Elizabeth's facade would soon crack, revealing a heart that was anything but nurturing. As the weeks turned into months, the Thomas family remained blissfully unaware of the dark reality unfolding behind their closed doors. Elizabeth's behavior toward Amara gradually morphed from benign neglect into something far more sinister. While Michael and Julia were preoccupied with their high-powered jobs, their daughter's once joyful spirit began to wither. The bright-eyed girl who loved to sing and dance was becoming a shadow of her former self, retreating into silence and solitude. Amara's transformation was subtle at first, her laughter fading into whispers, her vibrant drawings replaced by dark scribbles. Each day, as Elizabeth arrived to take on her role as caregiver, a new layer of emotional turmoil would settle over Amara. It was as if the light in her eyes dimmed with every unkind word or cold glance from the woman who was supposed to care for her. Yet, in the bustling Thomas household, the alarm bells went unheard. Michael and Julia attributed Amara's changes to the trials of growing up, failing to grasp the depths of her pain. In her room, Amara often found solace in her drawings, pouring her feelings onto paper as a means of escape. These artworks told stories of vibrant worlds and adventures, but they also revealed her inner turmoil, a clash between the joyous girl she once was and the frightened child she had become. Her parents' love remained a constant presence in her life, yet it felt distant and unreachable, as if she were peering at it through a foggy window. Amara craved their attention and understanding, but the more she retreated into her shell, the more her parents were consumed by their careers. As summer waned and school approached, Amara's anxiety grew. She dreaded returning to the classroom, where she had once thrived. Her best friends noticed her change but were met with silence whenever they asked if she was okay. Instead of sharing her burdens, Amara buried them deeper, afraid of how her friends would react or, worse, how they would see her. She had learned to wear a mask of normalcy, even as she felt like she was crumbling inside. The school bell rang, signaling the start of a new year. Amara stood outside the classroom, her heart racing as her classmates chatted excitedly about their summer adventures. She forced a smile, but inside, she felt a weight pressing down on her chest. The cheerful atmosphere seemed to mock her loneliness. Mrs. Stevens, her teacher, sensed something was off. A caring woman with a knack for nurturing her students, Mrs. Stevens often took the time to check in with those who seemed withdrawn. But no matter how gently she approached, Amara could not bring herself to share her pain. As the days turned into weeks, the once promising school year turned into a nightmare for Amara. The growing distance from her parents, the strain of the unending abuse from Elizabeth, and the ever-tightening grip of her isolation began to engulf her completely. Each morning, as she readied herself for another day of pretending, Amara clung to the hope that somehow, someway, her parents would see through her carefully constructed facade and reach out to her. Yet, within the Thomas household, life continued its relentless pace. Michael was often in and out of meetings, while Julia was consumed by her latest case. They never noticed the bruises that formed not only on Amara's body but on her spirit. The girl who once danced with joy was now just a shadow, trapped in a world of silent suffering. As autumn settled over the Thomas household, the air grew cooler, but the warmth of love and connection felt increasingly distant for Amara. With each passing day, the burden of her hidden pain became heavier, while Elizabeth's presence morphed from that of a trusted caregiver into an ominous figure of dread. The contrast between the outside world, filled with the laughter of children and the love of family, and Amara's internal struggles created a dissonance that echoed in the very core of her being. The Thomas family's routine remained unchanged. Breakfast was still a bustling affair, with Michael reading the news on his tablet while Julia prepared to leave for her law firm. They would often exchange brief conversations, filled with the kind of polite banter that masked the underlying disconnect in their family. They assumed that everything was in order, content with their belief that hiring Elizabeth was the right choice, a means to ensure their daughter received the best care while they pursued their demanding careers. Yet, they were completely unaware of the dark reality lurking just beneath the surface. In the confines of their home, Amara's life had become a series of hidden wounds and muffled cries. Elizabeth's methodical cruelty was relentless. She had a knack for delivering sharp, cutting remarks disguised as criticism, all aimed at diminishing Amara's self-esteem. "You'll never be as smart as the other kids," Elizabeth would sneer, her eyes cold and unyielding. "Why can't you just behave like a normal girl?" These words were daggers that pierced through Amara's heart, leaving scars that no one else could see. Despite the torment she faced, Amara tried to cope in her own way. She found fleeting moments of joy in her imagination, crafting elaborate stories in her mind where she was the hero, capable of conquering her fears. During these moments, she would daydream of a loving family, where laughter filled the air, and each member understood and supported one another. But reality would always pull her back, a cruel reminder that her home was anything but a sanctuary. At school, Amara's situation only worsened. The once vibrant girl who eagerly raised her hand in class now sat quietly in the back, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when absolutely necessary. Her friends noticed the change, the way she seemed to shrink into herself. They tried to include her in games and conversations, but Amara felt like a ghost among them, invisible and untouchable. Whenever they invited her to join their activities, she would shake her head, a practiced smile barely masking the turmoil within. Mrs. Stevens, her teacher, was increasingly concerned. One afternoon, she gently approached Amara after class. "You know, Amara, if you ever want to talk, I'm here," she offered, her voice warm and inviting. But Amara merely nodded, unable to muster the courage to speak her truth. How could she explain to Mrs. Stevens that her silence was not a choice but a prison? That every time she tried to speak, the fear of disbelief paralyzed her? As weeks turned into months, the emotional and psychological abuse Amara faced escalated. Elizabeth's actions grew more overt, no longer content with mere insults. She began to physically intimidate Amara, invading her personal space and looming over her with a threatening presence. The once trusted caregiver now wielded her authority like a weapon, and Amara learned to flinch at every sudden movement or loud noise. One evening, after a particularly harrowing day filled with insults and intimidation, Amara sat on her bed, her heart racing. Tears streamed down her face as she wrapped her arms around her knees, rocking back and forth in a futile attempt to soothe herself. She wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the words felt trapped in her throat. What if her parents didn't believe her? What if they thought she was being dramatic? In her despair, Amara reached for her sketchbook, the one place where she felt safe to express her emotions. As she drew, each stroke of her pencil became a cathartic release, allowing her to transform her pain into art. She sketched dark clouds hanging over her once sunny world, figures with menacing faces and shadows lurking behind her. The drawings depicted a struggle, a battle between light and darkness that mirrored her own internal conflict. For a brief moment, lost in the world of creation, Amara found solace. But as the days passed, even her drawings began to shift in tone. The vibrant colors she once used faded, replaced by darker hues that reflected her growing despair. Friends and family remained oblivious to her turmoil. They saw only the cheerful girl they wanted to believe in, ignoring the signs of the storm brewing within her. Elizabeth continued to act as if nothing was amiss, maintaining her facade of the doting nanny to the Thomas family while hiding her true nature from the world. Despite her fears, Amara clung to a sliver of hope that someone would notice, that someone would see through Elizabeth's mask. Yet, each day brought new challenges, and with each passing hour, her spirit began to fracture. Amara longed for her parents' attention but felt increasingly invisible to them. At the Thomas dinner table, conversations flowed freely as Michael and Julia exchanged stories from their day, completely unaware of the silent war their daughter was fighting. Amara sat quietly, picking at her food while listening to the animated discussions about work and life. It was a stark reminder of how isolated she had become, a ghost at her own dinner table. Feeling trapped in a world where she had no voice, Amara's desperation grew. She longed to share her story, to reveal the truth about Elizabeth, but fear held her back like an anchor. What if she were not believed? What if her parents dismissed her fears as mere childhood drama? The risk felt too great, and so she remained silent, caught in the web of her own turmoil. As autumn turned to winter, the first snowfall blanketed the neighborhood in a layer of pristine white. For most children, it was a time of joy, of snowball fights and building snowmen. But for Amara, it felt like another reminder of her isolation. She watched from her window as the other children laughed and played, wishing she could join them, wishing she could escape the grip of her reality. One fateful day, however, everything changed. It was a Saturday, and Julia was home, preparing for a meeting while Michael was out running errands. Amara had been tasked with cleaning her room, a chore she dreaded, especially with Elizabeth's watchful eye nearby. As she reluctantly began to tidy up, Elizabeth's presence loomed over her like a dark cloud. That day, Elizabeth's anger seemed to rise like the winter storm outside. A minor infraction, Amara had accidentally knocked over a toy while cleaning, set off a chain reaction. Elizabeth's voice rose, filled with venom as she belittled Amara, hurling insults that cut deeper than any physical blow. "You're useless. You can't even do something as simple as clean your room," Elizabeth shouted, her face twisted in rage. Something within Amara snapped. For the first time, she felt a surge of defiance rise within her. She stood her ground, meeting Elizabeth's glare with an unexpected resolve. "Stop it," she shouted, her voice trembling but strong. In that moment, Amara felt the weight of her silence lift, even if just slightly. But Elizabeth was taken aback, her expression morphing from anger to surprise. For a brief instant, the facade slipped, revealing the cracks in her own power. Then, in a flash, her rage returned, and with it, the threat of physical confrontation. The cycle of fear resumed, and Amara found herself retreating once more, feeling the familiar suffocation of despair settle back in. As winter deepened in the Thomas household, so did Amara's sense of entrapment. The world outside, blanketed in snow, looked serene and beautiful, but for Amara, it only served as a reminder of her growing isolation. What was once a season of joy turned into a time filled with dread as the days passed in a blur of emotional turmoil and fear. Elizabeth's demeanor shifted from merely cold and dismissive to overtly aggressive, wrapping Amara in a cocoon of terror from which she could see no escape. Elizabeth had skillfully concealed her true nature behind a facade of caring for far too long. The verbal assaults, once cloaked in a guise of constructive criticism, morphed into sharp, pointed barbs that cut deep into Amara's self-worth. "You're so lazy, Amara. How can you be this incompetent?" Elizabeth would snarl, her eyes filled with disdain. Each cruel comment became a brick in the wall of isolation that Amara was building around herself, a wall that, with each insult, became harder to breach. In the classroom, Amara's struggle continued. Once an eager learner who participated actively, she now sat silently in the back row, her hands gripping the edges of her desk, as if anchoring herself to reality. Her friends tried to engage her, but the joy she once felt like a distant memory, obscured by Elizabeth's harsh words. "Why don't you want to hang out anymore?" her friend Mia asked one day during lunch. The question hung in the air, but Amara felt unable to respond, her throat constricting at the thought of revealing her pain. Instead, she smiled faintly and shrugged. "I've just been busy," she replied, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. Amara spent many evenings alone in her room, drawing in her sketchbook. Art had always been her refuge, but now even her creations felt tainted. The vibrant colors that once filled the pages turned into muted shades, mirroring the grayness enveloping her life. Each stroke of the pencil was an attempt to express emotions she felt unable to voice. She sketched scenes of children playing in the snow, bright-eyed and carefree, while her own figure appeared small and shadowed, standing apart from the joyful chaos. Through her art, she sought to process the feelings of loneliness and despair that were becoming increasingly overwhelming. As the weeks dragged on, Elizabeth's behavior escalated. What began as emotional torment now included physical intimidation. Amara found herself on the receiving end of harsh discipline, rough grabs, threatening postures, and the occasional slap that left her shaken. One evening, after Amara had made a minor mistake while setting the table, Elizabeth's rage erupted like a volcano. "You are so clumsy. Can't you do anything right?" she shouted, her face twisted in fury. The fear that coursed through Amara was paralyzing. She wanted to defend herself, to tell Elizabeth that she was trying her best, but the words caught in her throat. That night, as Amara lay in bed, she couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that settled in her chest. The walls of her room felt like they were closing in, and the shadows seemed to whisper secrets of her inadequacy. Her heart raced as she replayed Elizabeth's harsh words in her mind. In that moment, she longed for the love and support she once felt from her parents. But even the thought of approaching them for help felt futile. What would they say? Would they even care? In the midst of her turmoil, a small glimmer of hope appeared when Mrs. Stevens, her teacher, reached out to her. One afternoon after class, she approached Amara with a warm smile. "Amara, I've noticed you've been a bit quieter lately. If there's anything you'd like to talk about, I'm here for you." Her genuine concern pierced through the layers of Amara's despair. For a fleeting moment, Amara felt seen, but the walls she had built were strong. She shook her head, whispering, "I'm okay," before hastily packing her bag and fleeing the classroom. The opportunity to unburden herself vanished, leaving her with the familiar heaviness in her heart. Days turned into weeks, and the grip of isolation tightened. Elizabeth's cruel remarks became a constant soundtrack in Amara's life. "You should be grateful I'm even here to take care of you," she would sneer, her voice dripping with condescension. The home, which should have been a sanctuary, transformed into a battleground. Amara felt trapped, her every move scrutinized, her very existence diminished. As winter continued its relentless grip on the world outside, Amara longed for an escape from the chaos that had become her reality. She often daydreamed of running away, of finding a place where she could be free from Elizabeth's torment. But as the snow piled up outside, so too did the fear and doubt within her. Could she really escape? Where would she go? It was on one particularly cold day, as Amara trudged through the snow to school, that she had a brief encounter that reignited a flicker of hope. A new boy named Jordan had joined her class. He was outgoing and cheerful, his laughter infectious. Amara watched from a distance as he made friends effortlessly, his smile brightening the room. During recess, he approached her while she sat on a swing, pushing her feet into the snow-dusted ground. "Hey! You want to come play with us?" he asked, genuine enthusiasm in his voice. For a moment, Amara felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. I'm okay," she replied, the familiar fear of rejection creeping back in. But Jordan was undeterred. "Come on. It'll be fun." His invitation hung in the air, and despite her reservations, something compelled her to accept. Maybe she could take a break from her pain, just for a moment. When she finally joined the other kids, laughter bubbled up inside her like a long-forgotten melody. As they built snowmen and engaged in playful snowball fights, Amara felt a spark of joy. It was a fleeting moment of happiness, a reminder of the carefree days before Elizabeth entered her life. But just as quickly as the joy arrived, it was overshadowed by the reality awaiting her at home. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-covered yard, Amara returned home. The atmosphere shifted the moment she stepped through the door. Elizabeth was waiting for her, and the tension in the air was palpable. "So, you've been making friends now, huh?" Elizabeth sneered, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. The air was thick with accusation, and Amara felt her heart sink. "I just played," Amara began, but Elizabeth interrupted, her voice rising. "You think you can just go and play like a child? You're supposed to be working, not goofing off." The anger in Elizabeth's tone was a sharp contrast to the happiness Amara had felt just moments before, and she shrank back, the warmth of the day's laughter extinguished in an instant. In that moment, Amara realized that even the smallest glimpse of hope was quickly snuffed out by the overwhelming darkness that had taken residence in her life. The cycle of fear and oppression was unyielding, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. That night, Amara lay in bed, tears streaming down her cheeks as she grappled with the reality of her situation. The flicker of joy she had felt during recess felt like a cruel joke, a temporary escape from the storm brewing within her home. She longed for someone to notice, to understand the depth of her pain. But as she drifted into a restless sleep, one thought remained clear: she was utterly alone in her battle against the darkness. As winter tightened its grip on the world outside, Amara found herself at the lowest point of her journey. The biting cold reflected the chill in her heart, and the days felt interminable as she endured Elizabeth's relentless cruelty. Yet, deep within her, a flicker of resilience began to ignite, a tiny spark fueled by a longing for change, for freedom from the darkness that had consumed her life. One fateful day, Amara returned home after school to find Elizabeth in an unusually good mood. The walls of tension seemed to have lifted temporarily, and for the first time in weeks, Amara felt a hint of cautious optimism. Perhaps today would be different. However, that fleeting hope was soon shattered as Elizabeth's mood shifted dramatically, transforming from pleasant to volatile in a heartbeat. As Amara entered the living room, she accidentally bumped into a table, causing a glass vase to wobble precariously. The moment froze, and Amara held her breath, fear coursing through her veins. Elizabeth turned sharply, her expression morphing from surprise to fury. "Can't you do anything right?" she yelled, her voice a thunderclap in the stillness of the room. Amara's heart raced as she prepared for the onslaught of insults. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," she started, but her words were drowned out by Elizabeth's wrath. "Sorry doesn't fix anything. You're a burden, and I'm tired of cleaning up after you." The words felt like arrows, piercing through Amara's already fragile spirit. As Elizabeth advanced toward her, Amara instinctively backed away, pressing herself against the wall. In that moment, a decision crystallized within her, a burning desire to break free from the cycle of abuse that had held her captive for far too long. Gathering her courage, Amara squared her shoulders and met Elizabeth's gaze. "Stop it," she shouted, her voice shaking but resolute. The words echoed in the silence, surprising both her and Elizabeth. Amara's heart raced, she had never stood up to her tormentor before. Elizabeth paused, taken aback by the sudden defiance. For a moment, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. But then, as quickly as it came, the surprise faded, replaced by a sneer. "You think you can talk back to me? You're nothing without me." Elizabeth lunged forward, grabbing Amara's arm. Pain shot through her as she fought to remain strong. In that instant, Amara felt a rush of adrenaline, fueled by years of suppressed emotions and unspoken pain. "Let go of me!" Amara screamed, her voice rising in intensity. For the first time, she wasn't just a frightened child, she was a girl standing up for her right to be treated with dignity. In that moment of defiance, something shifted. Elizabeth's grip faltered, and Amara broke free, fleeing toward the front door. Heart pounding, she burst outside into the cold air. The snow crunched beneath her feet as she ran, tears streaming down her cheeks. Amara didn't know where she was going, all she knew was that she needed to escape, to find a way to breathe. The weight of Elizabeth's cruelty had become unbearable, and the walls that had confined her for so long finally crumbled as she stepped into the open air. The neighborhood felt both familiar and foreign as Amara dashed down the street, her breath forming clouds of mist in the freezing air. She ran toward the school, a place where she had once felt safe, and where her friends had tried to reach her. As she approached the schoolyard, the sight of children playing filled her with a mixture of hope and despair. Would anyone understand? Would anyone believe her? Just then, she spotted Mrs. Stevens standing near the entrance, chatting with a group of parents. Amara hesitated, her heart racing. The teacher had always been kind, but would she take her seriously? Summoning every ounce of courage, Amara approached her. "Mrs. Stevens," she called out, her voice cracking with emotion. The teacher turned, her expression shifting from surprise to concern as she recognized the distress etched on Amara's face. "Amara, what's wrong?" she asked, kneeling to be at eye level with the girl. The warmth in her voice melted some of the ice surrounding Amara's heart. I need help," Amara stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Elizabeth. She's hurting me." Mrs. Stevens' expression hardened as she absorbed Amara's words. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she pressed gently, guiding Amara to a quieter spot away from the prying eyes of others. Amara took a deep breath, the fear of being dismissed hanging over her. "She yells at me. She's always mean, but it's getting worse. She hits me sometimes." The confession felt like a dam bursting. Each word was a release of the years of pain and fear she had kept bottled up inside. Mrs. Stevens' eyes widened, and she quickly took Amara's hands in hers. "Oh, Amara, I'm so sorry you're going through this. You're very brave for telling me. We will make sure you're safe," she promised, her voice steady and reassuring. Tears streamed down Amara's face as the weight of her secret began to lift. For the first time, someone believed her, and it felt like a ray of sunlight breaking through the darkest clouds. Mrs. Stevens led Amara into the school office, where she began to make calls to the authorities. "I need to report a case of abuse," she stated firmly, her tone leaving no room for doubt. Amara watched, a mixture of fear and relief flooding her senses. As they waited, Mrs. Stevens stayed by her side, offering words of comfort. "You're not alone anymore, Amara. We're going to get you the help you need," she reassured her, a gentle hand resting on Amara's back. In that moment, Amara realized that her world was beginning to shift. The weight of Elizabeth's cruelty still loomed, but now she had an ally, someone who would stand with her and fight for her. When the authorities arrived, Amara felt a wave of anxiety wash over her, but Mrs. Stevens held her hand tightly. "Just tell them everything you told me. You're doing the right thing," she whispered, her confidence bolstering Amara's resolve. As the officers spoke with her, Amara recounted the events that had transpired, from the emotional abuse to the physical intimidation. With each word, she felt a growing sense of empowerment. The secrets that had once felt like chains binding her were now being transformed into the tools of her liberation. Later that evening, the Thomas household was turned upside down. Michael and Julia returned home to find police officers in their living room. Confusion and concern etched their faces as they sought to understand the situation. "What's going on?" Michael asked, his eyes darting between the officers and Amara, who sat on the couch, a mix of fear and resolve evident in her posture. "Amara has reported abuse at the hands of her caregiver," one of the officers stated firmly. The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. "We're here to investigate the situation." Julia's face paled as she processed the information. "That's not possible. Elizabeth has always been so good with her," she exclaimed, disbelief coloring her tone. But as the officers began to ask questions and Amara spoke up, their skepticism began to wane. Over the next few hours, Amara recounted her experiences in the presence of her parents, and the truth began to unravel like a tightly wound thread. The more she spoke, the more Michael and Julia began to grasp the depth of their daughter's suffering. The tears that streamed down Amara's face were met with their realization of how blind they had been to her pain. In the days that followed, the investigation unfolded, and Elizabeth was removed from the Thomas household. For Amara, it felt like a significant victory, but it was only the beginning of her healing journey. With Elizabeth gone, the oppressive weight on her shoulders began to lift, and for the first time in months, she felt a sense of hope. As the dust settled, the Thomas family sought professional help to navigate the aftermath of the trauma. They began family therapy, a space where Amara could share her feelings openly and where her parents could learn how to support her healing process. The journey was not easy, and there were many tough conversations, but Amara felt empowered, knowing she was no longer alone. With time, Amara's laughter began to return, echoing through the halls of their home once more. Michael and Julia made it a point to spend more time with their daughter, prioritizing family outings and activities that allowed them to reconnect. They found joy in simple things, playing board games, going for walks, and creating art together. Inspired by her own journey, Amara decided to channel her experiences into something positive. She began volunteering with organizations that supported children facing similar struggles, sharing her story to raise awareness about the importance of recognizing and addressing abuse. The girl who had once felt invisible now stood proudly, a beacon of hope for others. In the aftermath of her journey, Amara and her family founded a non-profit organization called Amara's Light, dedicated to supporting children who had experienced trauma and advocating for awareness around abuse. The mission became a cornerstone of their family, uniting them in a shared purpose to help others find their voice. As the seasons changed and spring blossomed outside, Amara felt a renewed sense of purpose. No longer just a victim of her circumstances, she was now a warrior, armed with her story and a determination to make a difference. In the end, Amara emerged from the darkness stronger than ever. She had faced her fears, confronted her tormentor, and found the courage to reclaim her life. The journey was far from over, but with her family by her side and a newfound strength within her, Amara was ready to embrace the light.